The coronavirus pandemic has grown worse since February as new cases have increased in Europe and South America. India is also in the midst of its second wave, while there are fears of a fourth surge in the United States. With the coronavirus pandemic resurging at a worse rate than what it was in 2020, the demand for its cure is increasing exponentially with each passing day. This is also putting extreme amounts of pressure on vaccine manufacturers, and facilities were not prepared to counter the overwhelming demand as we see today due to the re-emergence of the COVID outbreak. Well, to talk more about the situation that we find ourselves in today, we're joined by Dr. Jerome Kim, Director General, International Vaccine Institute. Thank you so much, Dr. Kim, for joining us again at the show, on this show. And we spoke to you at the start of this pandemic. At that time, the vaccines were very distant. But today, who would have thought we'd be in this position a year later? Yes, there's a surge in COVID cases, but also a shortage of vaccines.
I think in a sense, we were very lucky around the vaccines. Almost every vaccine that has been taken into advanced testing has been shown to be safe and efficacious. We're increasingly having data now that in the real world, extensive use of the vaccines is actually associated with decreased hospitalizations and ultimately with decreased deaths. Whether the vaccines work against the new variant viruses is unknown. And unfortunately, we're seeing surges in coronavirus activity around the world, and these pose a tremendous problem. A problem for people whose family members or the people themselves who become infected are hospitalized and die, but also from the perspective of the generation of new mutants. To the extent that we can better control these outbreaks using traditional non-pharmaceutical, non-vaccine methods, and then supplement that with vaccination, the better we'll be able to control the eventual emergence of new mutants.
Right, and I'd like to get your opinion on the situation, regarding India and Covax. And we do know that because of the surge in cases here in India, we have stopped major exports of vaccines. The Serum Institute, which produces the AstraZeneca vaccine, is supposed to, provide vaccines to Covax so that it can provide to other poorer countries. Currently, we've put a hold on this. And tell us about that. What's your opinion on this?
I think that Covax is a very important mechanism. And to the extent that the Indian government and Indian companies can continue to support the Covax mechanism, which is one of the few means that we have to distribute vaccine to the poorest countries around the world, we have to do that. Now, we also, though, on the other hand, have to recognize that India has quite a substantial problem. And this new resurgence poses a significant threat to people in India, to doctors and nurses and other healthcare providers, to the elderly who happen to escape the first wave of the pandemic. So, I think that these are the kinds of things, these are the kinds of discussions that we should have had months ago, because we should have known that there were going to continue to be surges. And so ultimately, looking down the road a little bit, India and other countries around the world should support work on an international treaty that will help us to establish guidelines. Setting them up now is going to be nearly impossible because we'll have the Indian demands against the demands of Covax, against the insistence of certain high-income countries that their people be vaccinated first and that vaccine not be allowed to leave. The time to discuss this is not now. The time to discuss this is in the future. At the same time, we need to encourage companies in India and outside of India to ramp up the production of those vaccines. We have to establish that vaccines, like the vaccines made by Chinese and Russian manufacturers, are WHO approved, that the data that went into them, the clinical data and the manufacturing data that support the vaccines, meets the international standard. Then only will we be able to have enough vaccine to do what we had tended to do in the beginning, which was vaccinate as many people as possible, as quickly as possible.
Right. In fact, there's a lot of anger in India over the amount of vaccines that have already been exported. I don't think everybody understands this whole, commitment to Covax, etc., and how, the onus was on us as AstraZeneca is producing the vaccine here in India with the Serum Institute of India. But now Covax has said that the Serum Institute of India is bound to, keep up its end of the bargain and supply the vaccines that have been ordered from it. I don't know how this is going to play out, but that is the latest news that we're getting, that Covax has said that Serum Institute has to supply to them. We do know for the moment, at least, the Indian government has put this sort of informal hold on any major exports.
And you can imagine why the problem exists. You know, right now, going into Covax, we don't have that many vaccines approved by the World Health Organization. So to the extent that we can speed up the reviews, to the extent that we can get data out there on vaccines such as the vaccine from Novavax, which also may be made by Serum Institute of India, to the extent that we can rapidly test the vaccine from Biological E, to the extent that we can finally get approval of the vaccine from Bharat, Indian manufacturers will contribute to Covax and will contribute to the global solution. But we need answers quickly, and we need to be able to establish that the vaccines that are being produced meet the standards for safety and efficacy first, and then can pass the requirements for WHO for emergency use listing.
Now, there are some experts, who are arguing that we should do away with intellectual property rights, etc., when it comes to these vaccines, that there must be, this free transfer of technology to countries, because one thing is, of course, producing doses and giving it to countries. The other thing is giving them, the ability to actually produce the vaccines there. What is your view on this, and does it sound too idealistic?
It's complicated. It's not a simple thing to make a vaccine.
Sure.
A vaccine is not a drug. It's not a chemical. It's a biological compound. So I could give you the formula. I could tell you this is what's in the vaccine. But what really matters is the know-how. And it's a difficult thing to transfer. And not only do I need a company that can make a vaccine at extremely high quality reproducibly, so that you can make a batch of 100 million doses and make a second batch of 100 million doses that is exactly the same in terms of safety and efficacy. And that requires sometimes hundreds of different steps and all these additional tests to prove that as you went from the early product to a middle product to a later product to the finished product, that at each step we knew exactly what was in the process. And those are the international requirements. So it isn't as though you can transfer this ability, say, from Bharat to any company in the world and that they'll be able to do it. The other part, and people I think don't recognize this, is you need a regulatory authority like the DCGI in India that is used to going to visit companies, to being able to ensure that the vaccines that are produced are of high quality, and that the review of the clinical data from the trials shows that the trials were done correctly. They answered the scientific question that was supposed to be answered. Not all the regulatory authorities in the world are deemed functional by the World Health Organization. And that is a key requirement in order to get a vaccine approved by the World Health Organization for emergency use listing. So again, I think that it's important that we get vaccines out there. We have seen unprecedented cooperation between companies. I mean, how often would you see a vaccine from Pfizer being manufactured by Sanofi, or a vaccine from Johnson & Johnson being manufactured by Merck? So they are cooperating. But it's really critical that those organizations that receive the technology as a technology transfer or under a license be absolutely qualified, and that the regulatory authorities in those countries that are manufacturing those vaccines have the ability to ensure that the vaccines are being made and that will be equally safe and efficacious as the vaccines that were tested in phase 3 trial.
Right, and we've already had that one episode in which millions of doses of Johnson & Johnson vaccine were wasted because of the manufacturer's mistake. One issue is, of course, the shortage of vaccines, but the other issue is the vaccine hesitancy that we've seen across the world, especially in Europe. And then there was, the situation regarding the AstraZeneca vaccine, the clotting fears. What is your view on this? We still don't seem to be past it. It's created anxiety here in India as well. And even though all you experts continue to point out that it's a minuscule number of cases of clotting as compared to the number of vaccinations that have taken place.
No, I'm sorry, I couldn't, you were breaking up and I couldn't understand the question.
So I was asking about the AstraZeneca vaccine and what we've seen regarding, the clotting cases that have emerged in Europe that has also compounded the vaccine hesitancy. Your view on this?
So that's actually, and I think in a sense, this is a very important point. we're not disputing that the vaccine was made or tested correctly. In fact, we know that the vaccine is safe and efficacious, both in trials done around the world and then in a separate phase 3 trial done in the United States. We see that the vaccine is safe and efficacious. And it was tested in tens of thousands of people. What we're seeing now is a rare complication, something that's occurring between 1 in 100,000 vaccinated cases and 1 in 750,000 vaccinated cases. So these are things that we could only see as we say, safety signals, if we have in place the proper way to review safety after a vaccine is approved. These are very important things, and they're working. So from the sense of public safety and the idea that we are trying to ensure safe and efficacious vaccines, the systems that were put into place to catch even very, very rare events is working. So that's the good news. The bad news is that there appears to be a link between the AstraZeneca vaccine and the rare occurrence of these blood clots. And it's still not clear exactly what's causing it. And individual countries will have to balance the risk of vaccination against the benefits of vaccination. So, 1 in 100,000 people will get a blood clot. And there are treatments available for those particular kinds of blood clots. On the other hand, if you prevent 100,000 infections with a mortality rate of 2%, you save thousands of lives. So countries will need to look at their specific situations with regard to the resurgence of COVID or relative COVID control, and then decide whether it's proper to vaccinate everyone or vaccinate people above a certain age, which is happening anyway, or whether to offer vaccination to all people, knowing that there are going to be risks, particularly in the younger populations. So Korea is using 60. Everyone who receives the AstraZeneca vaccine is over the age of 60. The UK is using 30. So each country will make a different assessment of the risk and benefit of vaccination, and that is very important. And individual countries will have to review their own data.
And each country should now also, given that this linkage has been found, as you said, there are ways to deal with this clotting and give certain advisory with the vaccine?
I'm sorry, is there particular advice around the vaccine?
Regarding clotting, because so far in India, our authorities have said there have been no cases of clotting so far, but we have seen what's happening in UK, etc. So should there be some kind of advisory with the vaccine regarding clotting and how to handle it?
So again, so these vaccines now, it's very important to recognize, these vaccines are not given general market authorization. They're being used typically under conditional or emergency use. So essentially, you have to tell the person being vaccinated that this vaccine is still being tested, that we don't know the long-term complications, and now healthcare providers who are administering vaccinations should be informing volunteers or patients that they are receiving vaccines that should protect them against COVID-19, but that have certain risks, very rare risks. I mean, it's hard to explain to a person what the real risk of 1 in 100,000 means.
Yes, that's true.
And that people will think, well, that means that if I vaccinate 10 of my friends are vaccinated, maybe one of them will have a blood clot, and it's not that at all. It's difficult for people to imagine what 1 in 100,000 really means, but healthcare providers are going to have to explain that this vaccination should protect you, but is not risk-free, and these are the reasons. We can minimize that risk by choosing the right population. So as I said before, certain countries are setting limits, right, and they're tending to vaccinate older people with the AstraZeneca vaccine. That's not an option in many countries. And so those countries are going to have a particularly difficult time trying to determine which vaccine to use.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Jerome Kim, for joining us again on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, India has set another record of daily COVID cases with 1,31,968 infections in the last 24 hours, pushing the total case count to over 1.3 crore. And this surge, remember, is much steeper than last year's first wave and has forced many states to impose curbs. This is the fourth time that India has reported over 1 lakh new cases. Well, to talk more about the situation in India as well as in the United States, which is the worst affected country, we're now joined by Dr. Saad Omer. He joins us to talk about the situation that we're seeing in both countries. Thank you so much, Doctor, for joining us. And first and foremost, if you could, tell us about the situation in the United States.
Yeah, so the cases came down and then they kind of plateaued. And so here we know that the B.1.1.7 has taken up as the primary or one of the major variants in the US. And that was expected based on predictions from late February and early March, as early as that time. And so that's not surprising. So what that has done is increase the number of cases, but the number of deaths have remained the same, or in certain places are continuing to decline. And so this decoupling is the result ostensibly of this mortality first strategy that WHO recommended, that overall the US and many countries applied, meaning focusing on the highest risk groups first, people in nursing homes in the US, older individuals first. So what has happened, even as the vaccine coverage picks up in the general population, the most vulnerable were protected first. So then you will see that decoupling between the cases and deaths. And we have the earliest signs of that. And as they say in the vaccine world, vaccines work. And sometimes they work in this overall interruption of transmission. You need higher numbers of vaccinees for that. And sometimes they work in this decoupling between mortality and infection. So that's what you're seeing. In the US, there's a mixed scenario in terms of the number of cases, and certain states actually, and there is a lesson for everyone that there is no magic around these controlled measures. If you ease up on those, cases will go up. And so that's what's happening in several states in the US. Here, this protection of older age groups and high-risk groups is giving some dividends, and not drastic drops, but some drops, and basically not a concomitant rise in death, even if you account for the lag that happens between cases and deaths. But other countries where the percentage coverage is still not high, need to remain vigilant, at least in the short term.
All right, so that's how you were seeing, cases, they're increasing, but vaccination also going up in the United States. There was also a report of the double mutant strain of COVID, which has been discovered in India, one case of it being detected in California. If you could tell us about that, how concerning is it?
Well, so we have to keep an eye on these variants with multiple mutations, or sort of set of mutations. And all sorts of variants. So there is some uncertainty around it. We do know that some of these variants spread more easily. And there is mixed evidence around vaccine effectiveness against them, around some of these variants. This new variant that you're talking about, or this variant that you're talking about, we don't have a lot of data. But the good news is that these vaccines seem to work overall more effectively, even in the presence of variants against severe disease, even if they don't prevent lab-confirmed infection. So there is some good news there. It is a sign that we need to keep an eye on. And more importantly, this is the time to continue some of our non-pharmaceutical interventions, meaning other precautions. There will be a time when most countries or many countries at least will have high enough coverage that they can ease up on their other guidance, but at least at this time, the variants highlight the need for remaining vigilant.
Now in India, it seems like we're trying to play down the role of variants in this wave of COVID infections that we're seeing. At the same time, many experts have pointed out we're not doing enough of the genomic sequencing to really know the full extent of the impact of variants.
Yeah, so I think there is, I understand, I have, empathy with the government's position in India, because it is unclear how widespread these variants are at this point in countries like India. They have the potential to become more widespread, and places have had their, third wave or second wave or the fourth wave, depending on the country, even without the variants. So I understand that, and there is this caveat that genomic surveillance is not widespread in India like in many other countries, etc. US has built up its capacity only recently to track these viruses and sequence it in more detail. But in any case, I think there is a genuine uncertainty. This is something that we should keep an eye on. But the big policy decisions remain the same, which is vaccinate as many people as possible, as quickly as possible, and continue the non-pharmaceutical interventions at this point, and only ease up when you turn the tide of this epidemic in the country.
Right, Dr. Saad. Now, if we talk about the vaccines, in India, at least currently, we have only two vaccines, that Covax and Covishield. There's a sense among many doctors and experts have pointed out how approving the vaccines is taking too long. And we do know that it's because of the bridging trials that are required here in India before a vaccine is approved. Some have even suggested that perhaps we can do away with bridging trials. What's your view on this? How important are they?
I think it's reasonable to expect high quality data or sufficient quality data before a policy decision is made. But I would suggest that in a pandemic, it is also reasonable to look at high quality or sufficient quality data from outside India as well. There are studies, both immunogenicity studies, phase 3 trials, and now increasingly effectiveness studies around various vaccines. So I think the more tools you have in your toolbox, the more effective the public health response is.
All right. There's also, a thought that we need to vaccinate more aggressively in the hotspots and problem states and cities. This was something that was spoken about earlier as well, but dismissed. What's your view on this?
So there's an expression from ice hockey, not the field hockey that is played in India more often, which says that go where the puck is going, not where it is now. And so the idea is it is reasonable to have a regional strategy if the risk is regional. So I think it'll have to be a mix. So I think the mortality first strategy could be that deployment early in places that are at current surges, and also places where there is a higher risk of that spread. So that's reasonable because WHO gives that option. But in India overall, there is a generalized epidemic. So even though there is heterogeneity, so it will be, I don't think it will be wise to put all the eggs in that basket. So one middle ground could be that go to lower age groups in those high risk areas at this point, not, open up, but still protect the highest risk groups in other places as well. And so again, when you have restricted vaccines, you don't start interrupting transmission before 2030 or even impacting transmission before 20-30% coverage. You need even higher numbers to, even approach herd immunity. But even before that, you start affecting transmission. So short of that, the best strategy is to go after mortality more directly. And so that's why, this rationale that protect these people, the people who are at the highest risk of mortality, the highest risk of death.
All right, Dr. Omer, thank you so much for speaking to us here at NDTV.